Lekutei Sichos Chelek Chaf Ches, the Sicha of Bamidbar Aleph, Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. We are also having in mind Chayimushke Bas Chava Yael and Yosef Shlema ben Risha for a refuah Shlema Ukreva. Good fences make good neighbors. That's the expression. Today we're going to learn a Rashi that teaches us the power of fences, as well as a fascinating Hira lesson at the end of the Sicha. In order to introduce the Sicha, I just want to give you the context of the psukim that we are discussing. In the end of Perek Aleph of Chumash Bamidbar, after the Torah lists the numbers of all of the Shvatim, all of the tribes that were counted by Moshe and Aaron, the pasuk tells us that Levi, Shevet Levi, was not counted amongst the Yidden, amongst the rest of Bnei Yisrael, but they had their own census just for the people of Levi. And then it says that Levi had a job, which was to dismantle the Mishkan and then erect the Mishkan upon arrival to the new camp. And the pasuk ends with the words "V'azar hakariv yumas," that a zar, a non-Levi, that engages in this avodah of the piruk or the bniyah, the dismantling or the erecting of the Mishkan, yumas shall be put to death. Then the pasuk continues that the Shevet Levi, the pasuk continues that the Yidden would camp around the Mishkan, each according to their Shevet, according to their degel, their flag, which is a reference to a group of 3 Shvatim that was encamped on each side of the Mishkan. So there was something called Machne Yisrael, which is where the Bnei Yisrael would camp. And then the pasuk continues, V'haLeviyim yachanu saviv l'Mishkan ha'edus. The Leviyim had their own encampment around the Mishkan, which, as we know, there were 3 rings, if you will. There was the Mishkan in the middle. Around that was Machne Leviyah. The Leviyim would camp, and around that was Machne Yisrael, where the Yisraelim, the other Shvatim, would camp. But that pasuk, after saying that the Leviyim yachnu saviv l'Mishkan ha'edus, the pasuk says, "V'lo yiyeh ketzef al adas b'nei Yisrael." There should not be wrath against the Yidden, against adas b'nei Yisrael. And this is the Rashi that we're going to talk about today, and try to understand and learn what Rashi is telling us. In pasuk v'Leviyim yachnu saviv l'Mishkan ha'edus, the pasuk says the Levim will camp around the Mishkan Ha'edus, and that way there will not be wrath on the people of Yisrael. Rashi quotes the words, "There shall not be wrath," on his mefarish, and Rashi explains, if you will do as my commandments, there will not be wrath. But if you will not follow my commandments, that Zarim will enter, Zarim non-Leviim will enter into the Ba'avidasam Zu, into this Avodah of the Leviim, then Yiyeh Ketzef. So Rashi is explaining, it says, Hashem says there should not be wrath. If you follow my mitzvahs, then there won't be wrath. If you don't follow my commandments, and you allow Zarim to enter into this Avodah, which we will yet explore what Avedasam Zu is, then there will be wrath. Darfen verstehen, so we have to understand. Rashi has brought this principle a number of times, that from a negative instruction, you can infer the positive of it, and vice versa. Since the pasuk tells us that if we do fulfill Hashem's command, there will not be wrath. So it's understood that if you will not fulfill the command of Hashem, then there will be ketzef, there will be wrath. Thus is da Rashi mechadus b'pirushay. What is Rashi introducing? What is Rashi telling us that we don't already know? If the pasuk says that if you do what I tell you to do, lo yiyeh ketzef, then obviously if you don't do it, then yiyeh ketzef. So why is Rashi telling us? Afile mizal zagin. As Rashi will damad gizayin, even if you're going to try to translate, try to explain, the Rashi is emphasizing as follows: needs down that etzem inyan as well as v'im lav yiyeh ketzef. Not to tell us that if you don't listen, then there will be wrath. Nor as das is the ganze kavana from the pasuk. Rashi is telling us that the main purpose of the pasuk is to laznar in the main to tell us that there will be a negative consequence for not listening. Warum in dem Hein, as im Tasu ki mitzvah sai lo yeketzev, is doch gar kein Chiddush nita. Because the fact that if you will listen, there will not be anger, really that's not a chiddush. Hashem is not an anger person, an anger force, an anger being. In other words, the fact that Hashem will not get angry at us for doing the right thing, that's obvious. The bigger chiddush here is that if we don't listen, then Hashem will get angry. And therefore Rashi is telling us that although the pasuk says lo yiyeh ketzef, the purpose of the pasuk is to tell us that if we don't listen, then yiyeh ketzef. So even if you're going to try to say that that's the pshat of Rashi, is nechalz nit move on, still the Rashi is not understood properly. Why? Because we have a question. What is the arichis haloshen in Rashi? Im tasuk mitzvah say lo yiyeh ketzef, v'im lav sheyikonsu zorim avodas zu yiyeh ketzef. Why the long-windedness of Rashi? Rashi gedarf zogen bekitzer, v'lo yiyeh ketzef, hoim lei tasuk ein yiyeh ketzef. Rashi could have said, quoted the pasuk that there won't be wrath, and say, but if you don't do what you're supposed to, then there will be wrath. In other words, even if that's the pshat of the pasuk, to tell us that there is a possibility that the Eibusher will be angry for not listening to his command, so say just that, concisely. If you don't listen, then there'll be wrath. In Parashat Shmini, similar to what we find in Parashat Shmini, where after Nadav Avihu had passed away, the Eibusher commands Aaron and his other sons that they should not leave their heads unshorn, and because Leisa Musu, so that they shouldn't die. It says Musu. If you conduct yourself as if you are an Einon, and if you're in mourning, and you don't continue to do what you're supposed to do on this day in the Beis Hamikdash, then there's a death penalty for that. So in other words, over there, Rashi writes it very concisely. Im tasu kein tamusu. So the question is, why couldn't Rashi do the same thing over here? Im lei tasu kein yiyeh ketzef. If you won't do what you're told, there'll be wrath. So in other words, even if the chiddush of Rashi is that there is a punishment, there is wrath for not doing what you're supposed to do in this case, it still doesn't explain why Rashi has to write it out in such a long way. The Farshim answer, as the Chiddush von Rashi does, nicht that's meaning from im lav yiyeh ketzef. Now to lassen her and wenn der pasuk mein shel sein mitten v'lo yiyeh ketzef. The Mefarshim explained that the Rashi is telling us is not to introduce to us the concept that there will be ketzef, that there will be wrath, because that we understand by ourselves, as we just explained in the Sikha. The Chiddush of Rashi is upon whom is the wrath, upon whom is the ketzef, because the fumri atakemeinin. As the Verter Batzian sich zu Ascholos Apostel Balvim Yachnu. At first glance, you can understand that the words V'lo yiyeh ketzef are following the beginning of the pasuk. The beginning of this specific pasuk is that the Levim should encamp around the Mishkan, and you'll understand as Eib Zivel and Zayton Lo yiyeh ketzef. That if they do this, if they set up their encampment around the Mishkan as they're supposed to, there won't be wrath. V'im lav oiv di Levim lo yachanu. That if the Levim won't encamp as they're supposed to, yiyeh ketzef. That's how you would read the pasuk. V'alvim yachanu savav l'Mishkan edus v'lo yiyeh ketzef. If they don't yachanu, if they don't set up the proper encampment, then there'll be ketzef. Rashi Sheil then Pirush. Rashi comes to negate this understanding. Unis mefaresh v'im lav sheyikonsu zorim ba'avei dasam zu. If not, if they don't do what they're told, and referring to what, that the zorim non-Levium will enter into the aveda of the Levium. As the V'lo yiyeh ketzef is a hamshach to Friedikin pasuk. V'azara karev yumas. That the V'lo yiyeh ketzef is coming as a continuation to the earlier pasuk, where it said that a zara karev, a non-Levi, a foreigner, meaning to say a non-Levi that approaches the avodah, will be put to death. As Evi kanta zarim levi doesn't zuv, v'zena ketzef adas bnei Yisrael. That if zarim enter into the avodah, then there'll be a wrath. So in other words, that's what Rashi is coming to tell us. Not to tell us that there will be ketzef, because that I can understand by myself, but to tell us that what is the infraction which the pasuk is referring to, not the fact that the Levium won't encamp as they should. That's not the infraction of V'lo yiyeh ketzef that will bring to ketzef, but the wrath is going to come from the infraction of zarim entering into this avodah. That's the Mefarshim say, which makes a lot of sense, seemingly. That since the pasuk started that we're talking about the Levium, so Rashi has to clarify that the wrath is brought upon the Yidden when Zarim enter into this avodah. Aber dem ist verstandig. Says the Rebbe that this doesn't either answer our questions. Aleph Kanal, was is the Arichas in Aschalas Lashon Im Tasu ki mitzvayisai lo yeh ketzef, Ma'ika Mashmalon. It still doesn't answer the long-windedness of Rashi. Why Rashi has to start and say that if you will do my mitzvahs, then there won't be wrath. What don't I know? Rashi had gedacht on mitten lav oim yikonsu yeh ketzef. Rashi should have started with a negative, that if you do the avodah that you're not supposed to do, then there'll be ketzef. So even this explanation of the Meforshim still doesn't explain why Rashi starts with the hein, why Rashi starts with, if you will do what I've told you to do, then there will not be ketzef. Even for some reason, as we'll explain, Rashi has to start with the hein with a positive, that if you will listen, then there won't be ketzef, there won't be wrath. If you will do as my mitzvahs, as my commandments, without specifying which mitzvah we're referring to. By the positive, he should have said, as he says, by the negative. If the Zarim don't enter into the Avodah of the Levium, then there won't be wrath. But if they will, ketzef. So why, when it comes to the hein, to the positive, Rashi just speaks ambiguously and says, if you will do as my mitzvahs. Gimel. A third question. So question 1 is why barichis. Question 2, why use the term ki mitzvosai and not spell out which prohibition Rashi, the pasuk is referring to. Gimel, a third question. Eichem lashon Rashi, sheyikansu zarim ba'avidasam zu, that the zarim, the foreigners, will enter into this avodah, is nitklatik also not understood. Rashi normally uses the terminology of the pasuk. Instead of using the term hakarev, which the pasuk is, which is the terminology of the pasuk, Rashi uses the term sheyikansu, and because of that, he also says ba'avedasam in the avodah. Why does Rashi speak in the plural zarim, foreigners, when the pasuk says v'hazara karev in the single a zar, a foreigner? Okay, so this is the Rebbe's questions on the first part of Rashi. Number 1. If miklal hein at shemei alav, then why does Rashi have to say anything over here? Even if you want to say that Rashi is telling us a chiddush, that the chiddush of the pasuk is that there is punishment, why does Rashi speak so ba'arichas, so elaborate? In the Mefarshim will say that the chiddush over here is that the Isser, the prohibition that we're speaking about, is zarim entering into the avodah of the Levium, and not the issue of Halavim Yachanu. Still doesn't explain the following. Number 1, again, why the long-windedness? Even if you are going to start with the hein, with a positive, why use the term ki mitzvosai and not specify which Isser we're talking about? And number 3, why say sheyikansu and not something that has to do with hakarev, sheyiskarvu, or something like that? And why say zarim in the plural and not zar in the single term? Before we could get to understanding the Rashi, we have to first explore the second part of Rashi, and then we'll go back to understand the whole Rashi. Rashi brings a proof to what he's saying, and he says, as we find by the story of Kerach, ki yatsa haketzef v'gomer, the wrath has come out. Just for context of that pasuk, after the 250 people entered into the Mishkan and brought Ketores, and then they died. The Yidden came out and with a complaint on Moshe and Aaron. Atem hamitem esam Hashem, you killed Hashem's people, 250 people that died. So Moshe says to Aaron, take the machta, take the pan, and run to be mechaper, to atone for the Jewish people. Ki yotza haketzef heichel hanagef. The wrath is out. The plague has begun, and a plague affected the Jewish people, and I think 24,000 people died from this plague before Aaron had a chance to stop it with the atonement for the Jewish people. So Rashi is saying over there, you see ki yatsa ketzef. You see the term ketzef, that there was an anger from Hashem. Says the Rebbe, is in ganz nicht verstandig. It's entirely not understood. What's Rashi trying to bring? What do we need a proof for? Darf man denn ankommen zur Reihe, als wenn der Eibischter warnt mit einem Einisch Ketzef vor dem Chet von Kiru Zorla Aveda, wenn Taka ankommen der Einisch, you have to say that if Hashem threatens, so to speak, a Ketzef, a wrath, a punishment for the Zor entering into the Aveda, that it'll actually happen. It's obvious. If Hashem says there's going to be a punishment, there'll be a punishment. So what do we need a proof for that we have to bring in the story of Kerach? Beis ve'ikir. But here's an even greater issue. How is the Maisa of Kerach even a proof in the first place? Which seemingly is unrelated to the content of this pasuk. But Maisa Kerach is a Yatsa Kesef von Hashem, nicht verbunden mit Novin von Yikanzu Zorim Avidas Mazu. At the story of Kerach, the wrath of Hashem is not connected with what we're talking about. The fact that Zorim had entered into the Aveda. The Beshachas the Magefa Afiten, the Farvas haben sich misleinen given, mimacheros von Maisa Kerach, atam mitemes Hashem. Over there, the plague broke out because on the next day the Jews complained, the Yidden complained against Moshe and Aaron that you killed Hashem's people. This is what brought out the wrath of Hashem. Nothing to do with the Zorim in the Aveda. Nochmer, additionally, even though in that case there was a punishment on the 250 people that brought keteris, which seemingly they did the same thing. They were not koyanim or leviim, they were zarim, and they entered into the mishkan and they brought keteris. So maybe you do see the concept of a zar entering into the mishkan. Says the Rebbe is need but you can't compare it to these psukim. Why? Psukim didan reden degen avedis haLevim. Our psukim are talking about the Aveda of the Leviim, which is to dismantle the Mishkan, to erect the Mishkan, and to protect the Mishkan. Over there it's talking about the Zor, a non-Kohen, including a Levi, that does the Aveda of Kahuna, which is much more severe than the Aveda of the Levi. Because the Aveda of Kahuna, even a Levi can't do. Because it was to bring Titus is a very, very lofty avodah that is only in the purview of a kohen. So to bring a raya from people bringing ketayris, which is the avodah of a kohen, to here, which is people doing the avodah of a levi, it seems that it can't be a good proof. Und es hat dich Gott zu sagen, als Rashi is nur uisen bringen a Dugma auf the meaning von Ketzef. I feel when the Retzich wegen an anderer geht. And it's very difficult to say that we're just bringing an example of another sin because the term Ketzef was used over there. And we want to say, oh look, here's another example of Hashem's wrath. If it's two different Avedas, it's two different infractions, then one doesn't really serve as a proof to the other. So the question on the story of Kerach is, number one, why do we need proof in the first place? And if we do need proof, what kind of proof is it from over there where it's not really about Zorim entering into the Aveda, and even if it is somewhat related to Zorim entering into the Aveda, it's the Aveda of Kahuna, which is a whole different type of sin. Mefarshim Zagin. So the Rebbe is going to bring in one more suggestion, refute it, and then we'll go to the biur, to the Rebbe's explanation in this Rashi. Mefarshim explain as the inyan in Rashi kommt behemshach zu afridik in Pirish Rashi avazara korav yumas, that this Rashi is actually coming to follow up on an earlier Rashi on the words that the zar, the foreigner that enters, will die. So Rashi is mefarish yumas b'dei shamayim. Rashi explains that this death is referring to coming from above, meaning to say not something that is meted out by Bezdin. Seemingly, what's Rashi's source? How does Rashi know that this is talking about a death by the hands of heaven, so to speak, and not an execution by the hands of Bezdin? The Adirabba, on the contrary, if a pasuk v'gam ba'ol of Yumas in Parashas Mishpatim, there's a pasuk in Mishpatim which is talking about a person whose shoyer, whose animal had become a muad, had become one that habitually gores and kills, and in this case he didn't protect it and it killed someone. So the pasuk says that the shoyer, the ox, is killed. The gam ba'ol of yumas, and also the master, the owner, also dies. Is Rashi mefaresh b'dei shamayim? Rashi says this death of the owner is done by above, by heaven, not by Bezdin. Then Rashi says, Yachol b'di Adam. I would think maybe Yumas means he should be put to death by Bezdin. Talmud Leimar, and Rashi brings a proof to refute that. Zetman, but from this we could see, as lule derayim imakim acher, v'ben gedarf taichan Yumas hamisi b'di Adam. That if not for this other proof, we would have translated Yumas means that death means executed by Bezdin. So here too it says Yumas. Rashi says B'dei Shamayim and doesn't give us the proof or the reason why he goes there. Then bring Rashi and therefore saying the Mefarshim that because of that Rashi here on this pasuk Lo Yeketzev. As we learned it's from pasuk Lo Yeketzev, Rashi says we learned it from Lo Yeketzev. But Meitan in B'dei Shamayim. Ketzev means anger from Hashem. That means that the punishment is going to be from Hashem, from above, and not through Bezdin. Like we find in the story of Kerach, but the Ma'aser Kerach is that Einish from the Makrivi activities b'dei Shamayim. Over there also it was a plague. It was the 250 people that died wasn't a plague, but it was a death that came from above. It didn't go through Bezdin. And so therefore, is there from Muchach as Vazara Kodev Yumas b'dei Shamayim, and therefore we could see that there it says Ketzev, and the death that happened to the 250 people was b'dei Shamayim. So to over here, Misa b'dei Shamayim. So therefore, Rashi is bringing the story of Kerach. The whole purpose of Rashi is to bring in the story of Kerach to prove that V'lo yeh ketzev, that Hazara Kodev Yumas means Misa b'dei Shamayim. Says the Rebbe, this is a very difficult pirush. But in dem pirush Rashi is the tot kein remes was ein friedike pirush Yumas b'dei Shamayim. In looking in the context of Rashi here, you don't see any reference to the previous pasuk of Yumas of the previous Rashi of Yumas b'dei Shamayim. Und from Pashtus was the Rashi da is mashma as the Rai from Ma'aser Kerach as of dem etzem in as ebi konsos arabav dasam zu yeh ketzev. And if you look at the Rashi and at the flow of Rashi, it seems that the Rashi is here to teach that the proof from Kairach is that if the Zarim enter into the Aveda, they'll be Ketzev. That's if you read the Rashi, that's what it seems to imply. Nowhere is there a reference to the fact that it's B'dei Shamayim or that this Rashi is continuing from the previous Rashi. So Ad Kan are our questions. Let's recap quickly. First of all, Miklal Heina Teshemei Alav. Why does Rashi have to say anything at all? Seemingly, we would understand. V'lo yeh Ketzev. We know that there will be Ketzev if we don't listen. Even if you say that Rashi does have to tell us that there will be a punishment, the question is, why does Rashi have to say it out in a long-winded manner? Even if you're going to say that the chiddush over here is that the prohibition we're talking about is zar entering into the Aveda and not the Levium not encamping properly, still doesn't explain, number one, why Rashi is long-winded, number two, why Rashi uses the words ki mitzvaisai without spelling out what the prohibition is, especially since the whole chiddush of Rashi, according to these Mefarshim, is the prohibition that we're talking about. And number three, why does it say zar she'ikansu and not she'iskarvu or something similar to the term hazara karev? Why zarim in the plural and not zar in the singular? Then we had a question on the story of Kerach. Number one, why do we need proof from Kerach? What don't we understand from the pasuk itself? And number two, seemingly the story of Kerach is an entirely different story. Over there was a magefa, which is not what we're talking about over here. And even if you're going to introduce the concept of the 250 people that went in without permission to bring the ketayres, but nevertheless over there it's a much more severe infraction because they did the avodah of a kohen, while here we're talking about the avodah of a Levi. And even if you're going to say, as the Mefarshim say, that the chiddush of Rashi is to prove that the misa is b'dei shamayim, that's very difficult to say since nowhere in this Rashi does Rashi make any reference to that Rashi or to that idea. Okay. Now the Rebbe in Sef Gimel begins the biur. The haktim ha'orin, them say that Aksuvim by first commenting on the order of the psukim. And this is something that I referenced in the beginning of this year. Between the pasuk that says the Zara Karev, that the Zara that enters into the Aveda of the Levium will die, and the discussion we're having now with regards to the wrath of Hashem is the Torah mafsik mitten pasuk. The Torah interrupts with a pasuk that says V'chanu b'nei Yisrael Ish al machaneo v'ishal digel tzveisam, the Yidden, the children of Yisrael, the Yisraelim will camp each according to their encampment. each according to their flag, as I said earlier, referring to every 3 shvatim had a degel, litzivaisam, according to their families. And then there's this pasuk, the Leviim will encamp around the Mishkan, and then it says v'lo yiyeh ketzef. So between Va'azar HaKardev Yumas and v'lo yiyeh ketzef, there is a pasuk and a half that talks about the encampment of Bnei Yisrael and the encampment of the Leviim. Is nit move on, was is the pshat v'lo yiyeh ketzef? And because of this, it raises a question to us: what is the meaning of v'lo yiyeh ketzef? There will not be wrath. If the wrath of Hashem is the same thing as Zara Karev, we're not talking about the Leviim, we're talking about the Yidden that enter into the Aveda when they shouldn't, is the Kasha. Then the question is raised, wie kommen rein die Inyanim hanal wegen der Mokum HaChaniyah von Bnei Yisrael zwischen die zwei Psukim wir seien Hainuach dem Eines von Azor HaKarev l'Avedasam Zu. If the Ketzef and Azor HaKarev is the same thing, then why drop in the middle a pasuk about the Chaniyah, the encampment of the Yidden? Beis the Tarti Lam Pasuki Lamali. Why do we need 2 psukim? If Azor HaKarev Yumas and v'lo yiyeh ketzef is saying the same thing, Vos is Moisiv der v'lo yiyeh ketzef nach Azor HaKarev Yumas, then why do you need a second pasuk about the wrath of Hashem if it's really telling us the same thing, that there will be a misa, there will be a death to those Zorim, those foreigners that enter into the Aveda? So if we're talking about Bnei Yisrael and it's talking about Azor HaKarev, that the ketzef, the wrath is upon a foreigner and non-Levi that enters into the Aveda. Number 2, why stop in the middle with a totally different topic? And number 2, why do we need 2 psukim? To the Leviim. And if the v'lo yiyeh ketzef is not talking about Azor HaKarev, it's talking about the Leviim, says Beis Kushas and which would answer both of our 2 previous questions. Number 1, why drop in these other psukim? Because we're talking about Leviim now and not about Azor HaKarev. So therefore there's no problem with interrupting with other topics. And 2, Tarti Psuki, why are the 2 psukim? One is about Bnei Yisrael, one is about Leviim. So if we're going to say that we're talking about the Leviim, which would answer the previous 2 questions, and what would we be saying about the Leviim? As Eib the Leviim will nitchenes aisav on the Mishkan, that if they will not encamp properly around the Mishkan, even if it doesn't lead to a zar entering into the Aveda, it brings out a ketzef and the wrath of Hashem. You're going to say 1 second. For pitching a tent in the wrong spot, Hashem is going to kill someone. So the Rebbe clarifies, ketzef is pirushay nit einish misa, and in that the case, ketzef would not mean death, nor a leichter einish. It would mean something a lighter punishment. As when they act properly, the Leviim are the legion of the king. Hashem says the Leviim will be mine. They are given to me. The Leviim are Hashem's inner circle. If they will not encamp around the Mishkan, there'll be anger. They'll lose their VIP status. So if you're going to teach that v'lo yiyeh ketzef is not talking about a Azor HaKarev, it's talking about Leviim, that if the Leviim don't encamp around the Mishkan Eidos, then there'll be a ketzef, there'll be an anger of Hashem. They won't anymore feel or be that special Legion Shel Melech, the legion of the king. Is the Nachmer Kasha. Then there's even a greater question on that. The pasuk sagt mefurish v'lo yiyeh ketzef al adas bnei Yisrael. The pasuk says there won't be wrath on the bnei Yisrael. So clearly we're talking about an infraction done by bnei Yisrael and not by the Leviim. So because of this, the way the Torah structures the psukim, we're lost. We're trying to understand what's pshat in v'lo yiyeh ketzef. What type of infraction are we talking about, and upon who is the ketzef, is the potential ketzef? The Rebbe is up to Rashi. Therefore, Rashi says, "Im tasu kimitzvei saylei yiyeh ketzef." V'im lav shi kontuzarim b'avidosam zu yiyeh ketzef. The mitzvah Rashi miyashiv d'siranal in the psukim. This Rashi where he says, if you will do as my mitzvahs, there won't be wrath. And if not, which means that the Zardim will enter into the Aveda, there will be wrath. Rashi is answering this stira, this contradiction, the seeming contradiction in the Psukim. Das, was Leia Ketzef steht in Posik, Bescheiches zu Alevim, Yachnas, Avalim Mishkan, is weil das bei Worten zu sagen, dein Ketzef war das in Israel. The fact that it says Leia Ketzef with regards to the encampment of the Levium is because it's talking about the encampment of the Levium, but it's taking the precaution that there shouldn't be Ketzef on Bnei Yisrael, which the Rebbe will explain soon. Im tasu ki mitzvahs sei, ob mis mekayim die mitzvahs, was reden sich da in der Parsha, was teken kloli is, weil wir im Jachen und Savel mishkan edus kidele kamon, if you will do as my mitzvahs, which is the things being discussed in this Parsha, which primarily are focusing on the encampment of the Levium, dan v'lo ketzef, then there won't be wrath. But if you won't follow my instructions, this will lead to the fact that Zardim will enter into the Aveda, and because of that, this will lead to wrath on the Yidden. The Rebbe is going to give the Hasbara right now. But in a nutshell, the Rebbe is saying that the way Rashi explains is that Rashi explains to us that Kimitzvaisai does mean the Chaniya of the Levium, but the Loya Ketzef is going to be caused by Yikan Suzarim. So in other words, we're referring to both. And the way Rashi structures it, as we'll see, that's why it says Kimitzvaisai, not Yikan Suzarim, because at this point he's not talking about Yikan Suzarim. He's talking about all of the mitzvahs that are in this parsha, including the Chaniya of the Levium, etc. And therefore, but what the Rashi is telling us is that if you're not going to be careful about the Chaniya of the Levium, what's going to happen is it's going to lead to Yikan Suzarim, that the Zarim will end up in the wrong place, and then there'll be a Ketzef, as the Rebbe will explain here. The Asbara Bazeh. The Nekuda from the parsha is the main point of this parsha is the appointment of the Levium to serve in the Mishkan. At Sivui v'Azhara auf der Havdalah und die Gvulos, was der Eberster hat eingestellt zwischen den Levim und Yisraelim. In other words, we're talking about the separation and the boundaries that Hashem established between Levim and Yisraelim. Und damit wird verhit Azarim al Netzukum zum Mishkan. When you have proper fences, proper boundaries between Levium and Yisraelim, this protects that the Zarim should not end up entering into the Mishkan, which they're not supposed to do. Und der Far sagt on the Torah da. And therefore the Torah says, V'chanu b'nei Yisrael ish al machaneo v'ish al digel etzavesam, that the b'nei Yisrael should camp in their machane, under their flag. Es ist nicht bloß zu bewahren und vermeiden dem Inyan von Vazara Karav Yumos as only Tkumen zu Tana Vedas Levia. It's not just so that way to protect and to avoid the Zar entering into the Avodah. Nur atzivi farzich as man muss anhalten die Avdalos und Gvulos bei Bnei Yisrael. It's not just Hashem is saying, okay, you stay in your camp, so that way it shouldn't lead to Zara Kariv. But there's a mitzvah in and of itself to upkeep the boundaries and the separations between the Levim and the Yidden. So the Torah says, the pasuk is mamshech in dem chemer von abbieten die eingestellte mechitzes. The pasuk is continuing in this importance of protecting these established boundaries. Not just v'chanu b'nei Yisrael, ishal machaneo, but the Levim yachnu, also the Levim have to camp in their own space. And this is how we assure that there shouldn't be wrath. And that's what Rashi Madhgim will say, and now we'll see it in Rashi's words. If you will do as my mitzvahs, which refers to the establishment and the upkeep of the boundaries, there's no reason for wrath. But from this we can infer in the other direction as bitul mechitzas is gedem ketzef, because if there are no boundaries, there will be ketzef. Nor demot is there ketzef nor bekoyach, but that ketzef is only a potential ketzef, a potential wrath. The wrath will not be meted out yet because nothing happened. The boundaries were broken, but it didn't lead to anything yet. So therefore Hashem is wrathful, but not a wrathful that plays itself out in an actual punishment. The far as Rashi Masber Madgish, therefore Rashi has to explain but if not, which means that if you didn't keep up those mechitzos, and because of that, a zor entered into the aveda, yeh ketzef. When the breaking of the boundaries leads to the fact that zarim, foreigners, will enter into the aveda, then there is actual wrath, and it leads to the death of the zar that entered in. So we've just changed over the entire understanding of Rashi. Rashi is telling us something that we did not expect before we started learning this. That there's two stages here. Stage number one is do what I've told, which is the kiyum mechitzos, keeping up the boundaries. But the miklal lav atashmei hein, or is telling us something, a whole other thing. That if you're not going to keep the mechitzos, it's going to lead to something much worse, and that's going to take the ketzef from potential into actuality. And that's the pshat in the first part of Rashi. Im tasu ki mitzvahs, if you'll keep my mitzvahs that I'm commanding you here in this parsha, to keep up the separation between Levim and Yisraelim, lo yeh ketzef. V'im lav, but if not, she'ikansu zarim laveda, which will lead. So im lav, if you're not going to keep the mechitzos, then there will be wrath. But it's only b'koyach. And if it's going to lead to yikansu zarim laveda zu, that the zarim enter into the aveda, then there'll be ketzef b'poyel, as we saw earlier, v'azara karav yumas. Later, wir verstehen, für was Rashi ist mit Shana Bilsheni und anstatt nutzen der Loschen v'azara karav, sagt sheyikansu zarim ba'avedasam zu, weil die Psukim reden wegen Masundere Inyanim. Now we understand why Rashi changes the terminologies from the Lashon HaKasav, which was Hazara Karev, and in Rashi it says Sheyikansu Zarim, because they're actually talking about two different stages. The first pasuk is talking about the specific punishment to a specific zar who transgressed the sin and entered into the Aveda of dismantling or erecting the Mishkan. The Aveda was stated in the pasuk Mishkan. Und der Far steht Vazar Loshen Yachid. Therefore, it says in the single term. Well, Eicha Yachid is also the Aveda of Mishkan, because even a Yachid is not, even a single Yisrael is not allowed to engage in this Aveda of dismantling or rebuilding the Mishkan. But this Aveda that we're talking about in this pasuk, the encampments of the Yidden in their space and the Levim in their space. As it turned out, there cannot be you cannot break down the boundaries. The camp of the Levim and the camp of the Yisraelim have to be totally separate. Therefore, it uses the term zarim. Because if one individual Yisrael pitches a tent in the camp of the Levim, you can't call it an encampment in the wrong place. How can you say that there's an encampment of Yisraelim in the space of the Levim if there's a bunch of them? So therefore he says Zarim. Again, in the first one we're talking about Piruk Vakamas Mishkan, which is a problem of one person. Therefore he says Zar. Here we're talking about the Levim, Yisraelim moving into the space of the Levim. It's only really called a machana when there's multiple people, and therefore he says Zarim in the plural. Therefore Rashi also changes the expression from hakarev, which means to approach, to do the avodah, versus yikansu, which means to enter. And the Nunza pasuk was our pasuk, which is discussing encamping in the camp of the Levim, past it the roof the lashon karev. It's not, there's not really doing an avodah. No, you can't submachna. Mashenkin in Friedrich pasuk was that's like in Piruk Vakamas Mishkan is lahepech dot pasman the lashon karev. Over there, they're doing an avodah of the Levim. So therefore, we use the term karev as lashon lahakriv, to become close to do the avodah. Whereas in our pasuk, where we're talking about pitching a tent or pitching a few tents, it's not a specific avodah, and therefore it doesn't make sense to use the word karev, and therefore uses the word yikansu. So the first part of Rashi is fully explained and understood. Now the Rashi is telling us like this. That the prohibition of this pasuk is to keep the separation between the Machane Levi and the Machane Yisrael. that the Levim should camp separate from the Yisraelim. The Rashi says, he doesn't say if the Zara will stay out because not talking about Zara B'chlal. He says in the mitzvahs that are being discussed in this parsha specifically, which is the V'chanu b'nei Yisrael and V'chanu Levim Yachnu, the encampment of the Levim and the Yisraelim. And if you keep my mitzvahs perfect, lo yeh ketzef, like the pasuk says, there's no wrath because everyone is staying in their own lane and doing what they're supposed to. But if you don't stay in your own lane, then this could lead to ketzef, because what's going to the taking down of the boundaries leads to something much worse. If it hasn't yet led to something worse, then the ketzef is only b'koyach, is only potential, meaning to say that nothing actually happens. It's just wrath. But if she but if the breaking of the boundaries led to the fact that a zor actually ends up doing what he's not supposed to do, then there'll be a kesef b'poil. But again, the yikansu zarim is not referring to azara karev. It's talking about so. Maybe I didn't say it perfectly. I'll say it again. If there's bittul hamechitzos, which means you're just not being careful in the separation, then the ketzer is b'koyach. But if Levim, if Yisraelim actually move in to the Machne Levia, then there's a ketzer b'poil. So I wasn't clear about that. I hope I clarified that. If people actually move into the Machna Levia, then there's a ketzer b'poil. If they're just not careful with mechitzos, there are people coming going in a way that is not allowed, that is not appropriate, then there's a ketzer b'koyach. If they actually pitch their tents and they make a whole little Machna Yisrael inside Machna Levia, then there's a ketzer b'poil. Again, it's still not Zara Karev, which is why Rashi uses the term Sheikon Zarim. Okay. Sivav, now we'll explain the second part of Rashi, the Ma'aseh Korach. Apisa Zeh verstanden der Reihe von Ma'aseh Korach. Rashi is mit Uisen to bring in. The first question was, what is Rashi bringing a proof to? Seemingly, we know that if we don't listen to Hashem, there's a ketzer. So that explains. Rashi is der mit Uisen to bring in a Reihe of the Tzveik Sovsanal. Rashi is trying to prove this dichotomy. As a bittul mechitzas grede, when ze felder no the tasik mitzvah shen get a katzef. The very breaking of the mechitzas, the very fact that we're not doing kim mitzvah already creates a katzef. Aber leidach, then kum der katzef b'poil, erst nachdem it's dort that you can't sagen about das super b'mamis, but the katzef b'poil only it gets activated, it gets triggered when something actually happens. Usually, you would think if you didn't do kimitzvah, there's a ketzef. Here Rashi is saying there's a ketzef b'koich, and only after there's a yikansu zarim b'aveda there's a ketzef b'poil. So where do we see this concept where on the one hand there's already a ketzef but it's only b'koich, and on the other hand the ketzef b'poil only is after the yikansu zarim b'aveda? Does that Ma'aseh Korach, says the Rebbe, says that Rashi is telling us that this exact thing is seen at Ma'aseh Korach. The chet von Korach is given was gewollt in Vatland der Avdolos by Yidden. The whole chet of Korach was he wanted to break down the barriers between Yidden. As Korach argued, everybody is holy. Why should you, Moshe and Aaron, raise yourselves up above the Yidden? What's Korach saying? Why make separations between Yidden? And this sin brought a wrath from Hashem on all Yidden. Hashem says to Moshe, remove yourself from these people, and I'm going to destroy them. On the other hand, in them even though Korach drew everyone into his argument, is the ketzef nit given bepoil. The ketzef didn't actually play itself out. As Moshe and Aaron argued with Hashem, and they said one person sinned, why should you be angry at everyone? So in other words, Hashem was angry, but he didn't act out on that yet. And only after the 250 people brought the keteris to say their bittul avdolos gebracht to apel mamish, the breaking of the boundaries actually brought into actuality as yikrav ish zara shalei zera Aaron ula keteris Hashem, that a foreigner, one who is not from the offspring of Aaron, should enter to bring in keteris before Hashem. So much so that they were still arguing with Hashem because they saw that the people could go in and bring keteris. Is dan der ketzef as Hashem angeben from frier areis bepeil yotza haketzef. This brought that this anger that already began earlier with Hashem. It says Tiksef, Hashem was angry. But now it actually played itself out that the 250 people died, and later even there was a Magefa after that. So we see that on the one hand, the Katzef begins when the Mechitzas are not respected, but it doesn't actually happen in reality until the break in the Mechitzas brings to something actually happening where a Zor goes in and does the Avodah. So even though the Avodah is different, but the concept that it starts b'koyach, when you don't respect the mechitzas, and then it plays itself out into reality when the mechitzas are broken to the point that they are transgressed entirely, then that you see in Ma'aseh Kerach as much as you see it, and that is therefore a proof to what Rashi is saying that happens over here. This teaches us how careful we have to be with regards to another Yid. Although Kerach gathered the entire people in a battle against Moshe, it did not cause the wrath to come out. In other words, the wrath was there, but it didn't actually play itself out. Nochmer, because as long as he was still arguing it with words, and it didn't express itself in an action, even Kerach himself and his immediate people did not get punished. Only after there was a severe warning and they in actuality brought keteris is given their ketzef. Then, only then did the wrath come out into reality. First, there was the punishment of Kerach and the 250 people, and then the plague on all the Yidden. And from this there is a very, very profound lesson. You find a Yid who, for whatever reason, is not cautious in avoiding negative things. His calls man is kupnit in a ma'aseh b'peil laklek ala Kadosh Baruch Hu, as long as it has not yet played itself out in an actual action to go stand up against Hashem. Is it id noch in a ma'amed u'matziv as it hot nesiyas chen b'nei Elokim? He is still in a graceful place in the eyes of Hashem. There's no wrath. The Adrabah, the Eibishter is ma'irich af. The Eibishter prolongs his anger, and Hashem gives him support in an ava, as a tshuvaton, in a graceful way, in a loving way, that he should do tshuva, and become someone who is loved and precious in the eyes of Hashem, as the Rambam says. Now, when someone does something they shouldn't do, at that point, you have to deal with it. But as long as a person is not yet standing up against the Eibishter, taking down the boundaries, but he's still, he's slipped and he's fallen, but he hasn't yet stood up. Lachlik ala Kadosh Baruch Hu lekeirach did. We can still save him. And therefore you should have a different type of approach. You realize Hashem still likes this person, and Hashem is actually going to do everything He can to bring this person back. And this is a very, very powerful lesson in how to look at a Yid who is not living up to your expectations. To know that there's still an Asiyas Chen, there's still Ava, Hashem still loves him, Hashem still finds him graceful, and Hashem is extending to him the opportunity to do tshuva.